time, early in the morning before anybody else is there. If it's the right day and the sun is coming up over the pollution of Cairo, and you actually see the sun on the Sphinx's face, this thing has an emotional impact that no picture, no matter how good, and this is about as good as they get, can convey. It takes your breath away. It did mine the first time I saw it. And so the wisdom has this emotional content. That's lost knowledge. This is one of the blocks of the Valley Temple, of the core limestone of the Valley Temple. You see the way it's slotted into place. Graham, I believe, or Robert showed you yesterday, the Inca stones. These blocks here weigh somewhere around 100 tons each. The biggest modern cranes can only barely handle material of that weight, and those of you who saw The Mystery of the Sphinx know from the interview with Jesse Warren, the manager, where they had one of these largest cranes, saying that, in fact, the logistic problems of manipulating these things into place today, we at present cannot solve. In other words, this is, however they did this, we don't know. That's knowledge. Our Sphinx and all the rest of the art and architecture of Egypt, that is the wisdom, because that is what makes it communicable to others and that allows others to follow in that same path. This shouldn't be there. Okay, this is what I want. Okay, this is what set off some 40 years ago this whole symposium. This is the Temple of Luxor that Schwaller de Lubitsch called the Temple of Man. And Schwaller himself was, when he went to Egypt, here we go, I'm going to have to go very quick on this. When he went to Egypt, wasn't looking for anything in particular. He was there on a holiday. When he confronted the Temple of Luxor, he was already a practicing alchemist, deeply knowledgeable in all aspects of Eastern and Western mysticism, but he also wasn't looking for the lost wisdom particularly. Got to Egypt, was convinced that this strange temple with its asymmetric axis was an exercise in harmony and proportion, realized that this was built 1,000 years before Pythagoras, who was credited with being the founder of harmony and proportion, started measuring the temple, looking specifically for the golden section, or phi, that J. Kaproff has talked about, found that golden section deployed after a few months of measuring, but in such a sophisticated manner that it made everything that the Greeks did subsequently pale into, not insignificance, but it was relatively simple what the Greeks did. What the Egyptians did was so much more sophisticated that Schwaller decided to stay there, and the mathematics led to the geometry and the study of harmony and measure and proportion written into these temples. That in turn led him to look into the mythology and the symbolism of Egypt, which was all related to the harmony and the proportion, the number, and its number symbolism behind all of this. And in the end, Schwaller produced what everybody calls, including his detractors, the symbolist school of Egyptology, which of course turns the whole thing, is a diametrical opposite, virtually, of everything academic Egyptology has come to believe about ancient Egypt. So this is what led Schwaller on his quest. And here, these are just a few other shots of the temple, and you see when you look at it that when you see it from above as a plan, you can say, oh, well, this does look sort of harmonic and proportional. When you're actually in the temple, you don't get that sense at all. You're in a very ruinous temple that has a very particular power to it. All of the Egyptian temples have their own power, and there's no way, again, to communicate this in a lecture, but when you go there, you know in a second, your gut tells you, unless you're emotionally dead, your gut tells you that there's a difference between a Horus temple and an Isis temple and an Amun temple and so on. And the reason that you get that different gut feeling, I'll get to in a second. Hold on. Okay, this is the plan of the temple, again showing its geometric or its harmonic deconstruction, as it were. The temple itself follows this kind of descent of geometrical interplay, as it were, and to give you ultimately the figures, the proportions and of the temple. And then here you see what drives the academics crazier than almost any other single aspect of Schwaller's work, the human skeleton imposed upon the temple with all of the joints cut at key That's sort of the key articulations of the human body. And actually, one of the criticisms leveled at this is, oh, well, you can construct a skeleton any way you want, put it against the temple, and of course you're going to get those junctions, those correspondences. Actually, it wasn't done that way. Lucy Lamy, Schwaller's stepdaughter, prepared a skeleton. She was the draftsman for Schwaller over his many years of work, and constructed a skeleton according to the best biometric data available, and then once the skeleton was complete, superimposed it over the temple, and and these are the strange correspondences that you find. And then this is, I won't be going into this because it's a whole lecture in its own right, and then the symbolism within the temple shows that the different functions of the temple, the lower leg, the thigh, the mid-body, the and so on up here, the symbolism within these various halls and chambers corresponds to that function of the human body. So this is the temple of man. In other words, this is the temple of the microcosm. We embody all of the laws and principles there are in the universe. If we understand ourselves well enough, we understand everything else there is to know. So if we start with ourselves and go outward, we understand. If we start with what's outward and try to apply that to ourselves, we're not going to get anywhere. We're going to collect a tremendous amount of possibly even useful knowledge, but it doesn't become understanding and it doesn't become wisdom unless it goes from inside out, not the other way around. Now, Egypt expressed her wisdom not in formula and philosophical disquisition as we do. She expressed her wisdom in art and architecture. And as I said, there is no way to communicate that except to go to Egypt and experience it. And if you want a plug for my trips, well, it is. But the only way to get that hit or to understand the inner content, the emotional power that sacred architecture can exercise upon you is in fact to go to Egypt and experience for itself. And I mean, the number of reports are absolutely legion on sort of this transformational power. Florence Nightingale, who wrote a wonderful letters from Egypt back in 1850, said, how can people go to Egypt, come back and live lives as they lived them before? And this is actually true. I mean, anybody who is not dead at the center comes back from Egypt understanding what a real civilization was and how it comported itself. And the reason that it does that is enshrined in these few slides that we'll see here. This is the work of Hans Jenny, a Rudolfstein anthroposophist, who picked up upon the earlier work of a German or a Swiss physicist named Ernst Chladni in the 19th century. Chladni did very interesting experiments with sound and the nature of sound. Briefly, he sprinkled sand on a plate attached to a violin, bowed the violin, and when the violin hit certain notes, the sand rearranged itself into beautiful geometric patterns, which then dissolved into chaos as the note was passed, and then at a harmonic of that note, reformed again into a beautiful, somewhat different geometric pattern. So what Chladni, and then Ernst Jenny, 100 years later, devised various sorts of mechanisms, little machines, that allowed him to control the rates of vibration. And by vibrating different kinds of materials, powders, liquids, colloids, and so on, and photographing them when they produced these patterns, he came up with what he called the science of cymatics, which means the science of wave forms. And he did a fairly low-tech video of this back in the early 70s, which is commercially available. I don't think they have it here because I think I forgot to tell Dan Kolos to get it. But very, very interesting, because in motion you see this. In motion, well, these are just a couple of the patterns, but when it's in motion, you see these. You see the chaos, sort of the symbol of the ancient abyss. In other words, you see how matter, how the universe formulates itself out of chaos through the agency of sound. And suddenly you think back and you realize that in John it's in the beginning was the Word. And the Word, of course, is the verb, is vibration. And then you find this same understanding written into the cosmologies of India, Vedic India, of virtually all of the high sophisticated civilizations that ever were, but you also find them written into the cosmologies of so-called primitive societies that don't necessarily have written language or that never express themselves in this kind of art and architecture, and yet you find the same wisdom, the same science enshrined in their cosmologies and their mythologies. And then you're back again to our, where in the devil did this come from? Was this a legacy of this earlier lost civilization? I think probably it was. Or did they develop it themselves, because all of us have the capacity to develop that ourselves in principle? So maybe it was that. The point is that the physical universe that we know is the result of sound or vibration. In ancient Egypt, the world, in one of the creation myths, the world is created by Ptah, with words spoken by Tot, or wisdom. In other words, so it's wisdom speaking, vibration, that brings the universe into being via sound or vibration, as I said. So this is what's involved with Yenny's work. And okay, these are just a few of the wonderful patterns that Yenny developed. And we'll get into the symbolism here. But what this means actually is that in terms of the sacred science, understanding that it is vibration that produces matter finally, it is also vibration, of course, that produces the effect that art has upon us, all art. We know this best, or we understand it best in music. Everybody knows music is just vibration, and yet there's a tremendous difference between a Beethoven quartet, the Star-Spangled Banner, and the Rolling Stones. Each of these produce their own emotions, as it were, and they produce them solely through vibration. Well, it was Schiller, I thought it was Goethe, I made a mistake, but even I do. It was Schiller who said that, or who described architecture as frozen music. And this is not just poetically and metaphorically true, it's literally true, because architecture does in stone what music does in sound. In other words, it's visual vibrations that are affecting us, and we're inside the symphony, as it were, when we're in a sacred space, when we're in any space, as a matter of fact. We are being affected emotionally by the vibrational nature of that particular building. So when we go into an Egyptian temple, we are resonating to its harmonies and proportions and so on. And if the great sages of the past understood that each of the cosmic principles, which are the gods, as it were, the gods are not sort of strange animal-headed beings, they are the embodiments of cosmic principles, and those cosmic principles are all, in one way or another, inextricably related to certain numbers, interplay of numbers, which give rise to geometry, harmony, proportion, and measure. And when you know the secrets of the numbers, as it were, and the secrets of the principles, you are able to produce a building that will evoke within the emotional center of the beholder that particular principle. So even though we've virtually lost that, we've lost that knowledge effectively, this is what we're all busy trying to recoup. But when you go into a Hathor temple, you get a certain reaction to it. You're reacting to Hathor. When you go into a Horus temple, your reaction is very different. And it varies for different people. Some resonate to one more than another. But there's no mistaking the different emotional effects of these temples, just as there's no mistaking the difference between the emotional effect of a Bach cantata and a Led Zeppelin rock song. They're very different from each other, and the reason that they're different is because of their constituent their harmonies and the numbers that are involved within them. So when we go to Egypt or to any sacred space, Chartres Cathedral, or a very secular or unsacred place, modern architecture is mostly done by people whose only god is Mammon. And Mammon doesn't have many numbers associated with his particular reign, and so most modern architecture either leaves us cold or gets us angry, or gets us tired, because whoever did them didn't possess the secrets of the numbers. When we go to Egypt, we get absolutely, our reaction is totally different, because we are literally in tune with the gods. The manner in which Egypt expressed herself is then through symbolism, and this is a subject that is almost dead nowadays. We've virtually lost our innate capacity for speaking or communicating symbolically. What's so interesting is that we're on the verge of getting it back. As you know, in computers, there's suddenly a symbolic computer language that the computer literate can communicate with themselves or communicate to each other across languages even. An American, and I'm fairly computer illiterate, so I understand the principle, but I can't actually do it. But I understand with the people who are deep into computers, an American can communicate with a Chinese on computer via symbols, sidestepping language almost altogether. And this is a kind of a return, perhaps without the sacred content at the moment, this is a kind of a return to the ancient symbolic communications practiced in ancient Egypt and many of those earlier civilizations. And I'll just like to go, actually let me put it this way, the one legitimate symbolic method of symbolism that still is in vogue today, that will let you know how symbolism works, is the political cartoon. If you're privy to the cartoon language, you know that you can portray, for example, of the American Uncle Sam, the English, John Bull, La Liberté for France, and the Russian bear, now cut up into 14 pieces like Osiris, and arrange them in a certain context. And from that cartoon, you get in one single hit a total picture of a very complex situation that communicates itself to everyone in the same way, except that in other words, the political cartoon will mean less probably to a truck driver who doesn't follow politics than it will to somebody at Harvard who's with a PhD in political science, but everybody will basically get the same message as long as they understand something of the symbolic language. Well, when we get to Egypt, what we see is the same principle, but expressed in sacred cartoons. So when we go to Egypt and you look at a wall or something like that, a relief, very beautiful because it's all done by master artists understanding these principles of harmony and proportion, it doesn't actually communicate much to us because that's not our symbolic language. But nevertheless, to an Egyptian priest or an Egyptian initiate walking into that temple, the stories on the walls would be communicating to that person a virtual encyclopedia of very complex cosmological, mathematical, psychological, historical perhaps, information, and that whole, in other words, your being would resonate to those messages, just say to a biblical parable if you're understanding or if you're connected to, let's say, esoteric Christianity. So just let's see how we're looking here at some of these symbols. I'll have to go through them pretty quickly, but sorry, I didn't want that one. I want to go back. So to look at how some of these symbols work and why they work. This obviously is the scarab beetle, which is usually described as a symbol for the rising sun. But why? This is a dung beetle. It rolls its eggs. It lays its eggs in a ball of dung and rolls it along the desert for supposedly 40 days and 40 days. Actually, I never tested this and saw it was actually 40 days. It was really 38 or 42. But for a symbolic 40 days, an important number. And Each night it buries its ball of dung in a little hole in the sand. Each morning it digs it up. So that's the simple-minded explanation for why this humble creature should be a symbol for the glorious rising sun. However, it's what goes on in that ball of dung that's the important thing. The eggs hatch, the little grubs start feeding on the dung, and the sun warms the whole ball, fermenting the dung, providing feed for the little larvae in between, who go through the 3 stages of metamorphosis, same as a butterfly, and at a certain point, the little larvae lay their little larvae, go quiescent, and go into a cocoon. And there you see the cocoon. Actually, this is of a silkworm, but it's a very similar thing. And what does that look like in its little cocoon cut open? Sort of like a mummy in a mummy case, doesn't it? Or exactly like a mummy in a mummy case, you might say. So there you see the thinking behind this humble scarab beetle and this whole principle of metamorphosis, because the cocoon, out of this cocoon, after a certain amount of time has passed, the scarab beetle or the butterfly or the silkworm will break free of its bonds, the ball of dung will fall away, and the scarab will fly out into the sunlight, a winged creature, or symbolically spirit. So what's being symbolized in the humble scarab beetle is that sequence of metamorphosis from matter to spirit, and enshrined, again, quite brilliant, and I mean, as gross matter as you can get, the ball of dung, but from that ball of dung, and the fermenting action of the sun upon it, therein lies the food that will nourish spirit. And this is a very important message, actually, because one of the problems specifically, actually, with Christianity is that it tries to deny, or virtually, yes, I think I'm safe in saying that, it tries to deny the importance of matter, of the body, and concentrating entirely upon spirit, but without nurturing the body and giving it its due, it's impossible to fuel or to feed the little spiritual being that needs that food in order to go through those stages of metamorphosis and eventually become a winged creature in its own right. So this, what, and like a cartouche, but the cartouche is actually a bit different, Jim. Okay, so let's look at some of the other symbols and the animals. Why each animal chosen for a specific purpose is chosen because it best embodies the principle that that animal best exemplifies or embodies the principle that it represents. So here we have Anubis, who is in one form the guardian of who is in charge of embalming, and in another form as Upuat, name of the little robot going up into the chamber, in his form of Upuat, the opener of the way, or the guide through the so-called underworld, which really shouldn't be called the underworld, it's the limbo, the land, let's say the psychic land that follows death. It's not really an underworld or a netherworld, but there's no specific word that really captures it. You might almost call it a meta-world or a para-world, because in between the meta and this earth, as it were. But if you look at the habits of a jackal or dog, this is a kind of a fusion of Egyptian greyhound and jackal, you find that the jackal is an animal that takes putrescent matter, it eats carrion and turns it into living sustenance for itself, hence the connection with embalming. And the jackal is also an animal, or the dog, with a wonderful homing sense. You take a dog 40 miles away from your house, let it loose, and it's wagging its tail at your front doorstep in the morning. In other words, it's capable of finding its way, of homing its way, getting its way home, returning to its source through the darkness. Hence the choice of Anubis to play, hence the choice of the jackal dog to play this particular role. Here we have the actual Egyptian greyhound. This is called Thesemu Heru, the greyhounds of Horus. As soon as you have an animal associated with Horus, you realize that it must play some function of that sort. Usual explanation when you see these in the temple walls, like here you see these wonderful hunting scenes. Over here of the dogs pulling down antelope and oryx, is that the nobleman wanted to be reminded of all the fun he had hunting in the desert. Actually, it isn't that at all. I believe that the greyhound, particularly this greyhound of Horus, represents instinct under control, because on this path you're not going to get anywhere if your instincts are not under control. So the dog represents instinct under conscious control, and the greyhound, so the greyhounds are associated with Horus because this is a very important symbolic function, and also because of the recent astronomical work. This is a new study opening up. I'm inclined to think that some of these otherwise very strange friezes also have an astronomical content, and that's a subject that I hope will be opening up. Well, that's, I guess, a bit too dull. It's more hunting scenes. But here's an interesting one. Those dogs still exist to this day. They were pure. They stayed pure on the island of Ibiza, where I lived for many years, and I've always had these dogs. The last one died a few years ago, and I'm just too busy to get another one. But I think it was the dogs that interested me in Egypt, even before I came across Gurdjieff and Shvala de Lubitsch. Here we have the baboon of Tot, or Jehuti, whose other animal, or whose other form is the ibis bird. Now, if you look at the ibis and the baboon, they have certain very interesting habits. The baboon, in particular, can be seen sort of squatting in the sun on its haunches for hours, apparently lost in deep contemplation. The ibis is a bird that stalks through the water, endlessly searching for food, dipping its bill down and snaring sort of shellfish from the bottom and fish, and it's able, in fact, to correct for the refraction of the water and sit down and get its fish. So if you look at the aspects of wisdom, Jehuti, Tot, is of course the god of wisdom, or the embodiment of wisdom, and in order to acquire wisdom, probably the two most important aspects of that are search and contemplation, hence the baboon. And so with all of the gods of Egypt, each of them, the falcon is a bird that flies high in the eye of its sun. This is the representation of Horus, who represents the return to the source, the divine spark that is capable of immortalizing itself. And so the falcon is a bird that flies invisible in the eye of the sun, and then the technical word is stoops, dives incredibly fast, 200 miles an hour, swoops down upon its quarry, and then flies back again up into the eye of the sun, invisible, the return to the source. So each of the Egyptians, this is Sekhmet, the lioness, the consort of Ptah. She represents the fire aspect of the female principle. It's Sekhmet who does all of the work. Ptah, bound in mummy wrappings, holding the scepters of power, but incapable of acting himself, thinks it all up. It's Sekhmet who does the work. And if you look at lions, for example, at the lion and the lioness, you'll see that's basically what they do. The lioness does all the work, and the lion sits around, reigns and roars. So it's Sekhmet who actually does the work. Okay, what I'm going to do now is, because I knew this would happen, is speed up, because I'm going to just take you through. This is cosmology. Actually, I'm not doing that bad. These are creation myths expressing deep science within. It's now getting to be understood that enshrined within these strange tableaus is very profound scientific knowledge. Here we have, again, I'm going to go fast. All of these are scenes, all of these are judgment scenes, profound psychological, spiritual instruction enshrined in each of these. This is the symbol that you saw from Tutankhamun's tomb. In other words, ourselves, we are connected to stellar consciousness. In other words, potentially we can become stars, therefore immortal or eternal. Whether or not that's to be taken literally, I don't know. It may be that it is to be taken literally, but in any event, this is also a demonstration that the Egyptians, sorry, I wanted to go back there, that the Egyptians understood this connection, and that it presupposes that there was an astrology functioning in those very ancient, because you can't make a connection between stars and human consciousness without understanding that there is this connection between ourselves and the greater cosmos outside us. And finally, in terms of symbolism, we have here the twin principles of Horus and Set, who is not the god of evil, as he's often described. There is no god of evil. What he is the god of opposition. And the opposition is absolutely essential. Nothing gets done without opposition. Every time I turn on my computer and there's a blank screen, Set is staring me in the face. This is literally true, actually. And when you understand the nature of the opposition, you can actually welcome it. So even, for example, this last half hour, even all of this hoo-ha that's going on with this stuff, this is the opposition, and in fact, for me personally, that's fine. I know it has to be there, and the trick is to not go down under the opposition, but in fact to emerge victorious. When the opposition has been in the great Horus myth, Horus set and is then reconciled to him. But first he's got to conquer. And then in the reconciliation, you see the two heads on the same body, and Horus and Set reconciled. This is the principle, this is how it works, and this is useful information coming out of the myth applied to everyday practice. Everybody has this practice, everybody has opposition, everybody can use and conquer Set. That is one way of looking at the whole business, as it were. Okay, now let's go through a quick tour of Egypt. Okay, our Sphinx, which degenerates. From the beginning, Egypt is at its height, at its very beginning, and it descends into materialism and superstition. And here we see it at its beginning. This is Saqqara, the walls of Saqqara. Love to go into this, but more time, obviously no time. This is a reconstruction of Saqqara. Doesn't look like something built in 2700 BC, does it? It looks like some genius architect of today given free rein to produce a new University of New Mexico or something like that. This is obviously high-tech, sophisticated construction. Here are the pyramids and Sphinx, more of the same. This is the Valley Temple of Khephren, outside of the Sphinx. This, again, a reconstruction, not of the Great Pyramid, but of the other pyramids of Abu Sir. The same effect of high-tech, extremely modern, and brilliant functional construction. This is the Sheikh el-Baled in the Cairo Museum. No time to go into these wonderful inlaid eyes. But in order to produce them, this is the squatting scribe at the Louvre. There he is again, wonderful, those blue inlaid eyes that look straight back at you. In order to produce those eyes, apart from the difficulty of working the rock crystal, the different kinds of rock crystal into an eye, you have to understand the refractive properties. You have to understand the anatomy of the eye exactly in order to make an eye that looks back at you. So this proves, this is Old Kingdom, that the ancient Egyptians had this knowledge way back around 3000 BC. This is the furniture of Hetepheres, the mother of Khufu. As you see, gorgeous stuff compared to the rather Baroque and showy stuff that came later with Tutankhamun. Here we have the great temple of Hatshepsut, another example of very, very old architecture looking highly modern and functional. Over here, Hathor, the goddess of, one of the great goddesses. All the goddesses are one goddess, all the gods are one god. They're different manifestations. With her cow ears, because she's the provider of cosmic nourishment, and the cow is the animal par excellence that provides cosmic nourishment. Over here, the great temple of Ramses II at Abu Simbel, with the colossal figures of the king outside. In the picture, as I say, you don't get any idea of the grandeur of these things or of the scale, but now you get an idea of the scale. So when you're in front of Ramses the king, you get an idea not that, oh, Ramesses was this great egotist, usual explanation, but no, this is what we human beings have within us, and it's up to us to develop the king inside. Over here, the art is degenerating into Ptolemaic. Here we have Komombo. Here it's degenerate. This is more of Komombo. You see everything is much more florid, much less geometric, much cruder. This is Dendera. Again, a totally different effect that this produces on you. When we look at the art, this is Edfu, the same again. We're a long way from the Great Pyramid. You done? Can I have a couple of minutes? Okay, it'll come off the discussion. Everybody's happy because I'll read this. We can discuss later, actually, because when this closes up. When the whole thing degenerates, this is the Great Sphinx. Has become Tony the Tiger in Ptolemaic times. And you see Egypt dissolving into chaos and anarchy and the materialism of the Roman world, as it were. Some of these are very telling. Here you see, this isn't actually such a bad statue, but you see that the purity of spirit that infused Egypt for thousands of years has now gone entirely. Here, this guy looks as though he has just come home, and probably has. But you see, the effect of this is the glorious, the ba bird, the symbol of the soul, which in the New Kingdom looked like this, a totally different effect. You see, it's the same figure. Here we have another late Egyptian sphinx, hardly the one sitting on the Giza Plateau. Finally, the last gasp of Egypt in the catacombs of Chugafa, which looks like a sort of an underground Disneyland, where the symbols of Egypt have become these strange hybrid creatures. Here you have some more of them. There's the Apis bull. Egypt dies, Christianity takes over, does not actually usurp the temples, but in fact recognizes them as holy places and prints the Coptic cross into the old columns of Egypt. The Copts die out, Islam takes over, modernity, the 19th and 20th century, rationalism takes over, and the gods are finally reduced to a pad on the back of a camel, which is about as far as the situation can go. This episode, as it were, or this progression, or regression, as it may be, was written into one of the most amazing pieces of writing in the history of literature. And this is what I will conclude with. These are, I'll just read excerpts because we're pressed for time. But this comes from the Hermetica. It's the book of Asclepius. Supposedly these are second century or 3rd century AD texts, but they relate, or they are based upon still earlier texts. And this is a prophecy. So remember, this is written probably around 200 or so AD. O Egypt, Egypt, of thy religion, nothing will remain but an empty tale which thine own children in time to come will not believe. Nothing will be left but graven words, and only the stones will tell of thy piety. And in that day men will be weary of life, and they will cease to think the universe worthy of reverent wonder and of worship. Darkness will be preferred to light, and death will be thought more profitable than life. No one will raise his eyes to heaven. The pious will be deemed and the impious wise. The madman will be thought a brave man, and the wicked will be esteemed as good. As to the soul and the belief that it is immortal by nature, or may hope to attain to immortality as I have taught you, all this they will mock at, and will even persuade themselves that it is false. No word of reverence or piety, no utterance worthy of heaven and of the gods of heaven will be heard or believed. And so the gods will depart from mankind, a grievous thing, and only evil angels will remain, who will mingle with men and drive the poor wretches by main force into all manner of reckless crime, into wars and robberies and frauds and all things hostile to the nature of the soul. Then will the earth no longer stand unshaken, and the sea will bear no ships. Heaven will not support the stars in their orbits, nor will the stars pursue their constant course in heaven. All voices of the gods will of necessity be silenced and dumb. The fruits of the earth will rot, the soul will turn barren, and the very air will sicken in sullen stagnation. After this manner will old come upon the world. Religion will be no more, all things will be disordered and awry, all good will disappear. But when all this has befallen Asclepius, then the Master and Father, God, the first before all, the maker of that God, who first came into being, will look on that which has come to pass, and will stay the disorder by the counterworking of his will, which is the good. He will call back to the right path those who have gone astray. He will cleanse the world from evil, now washing it away with water floods, now burning it out with fiercest fire, or again expelling it by war and pestilence. And thus he will bring back his world to its former aspect, so that the cosmos will once more be deemed worthy of worship and wondering reverence. And God, the maker and restorer of the mighty fabric, will be adored by the men of that day with unceasing hymns of praise and blessing. Such is the new birth of the cosmos. It is a making again of all things good, a holy and awe-striking restoration of all nature, and it is wrought in the process of time by the eternal will of God. So you realize that this is about 2,000 years ago, and the front pages of the daily newspaper tell you pretty much the accuracy of certain aspects of that prophecy. The other part, the good part, the stuff that comes after, that's what we're trying to bring about. I mean, that's why we're here. Just upsetting a bunch of Egyptologists doesn't particularly interest me. Not a bad thing to do. It's amusing, but that's not the overriding aim. The overriding aim is to my part, clear the ground so that the seeds can sprout. And when we look at Egypt, this is its importance, because there we have the living proof. And mind you, when I'm saying this, I'm not saying that Egypt is a higher civilization than Vedic India or China or Japan or anything like that. It's just that it has left this unparalleled heritage of art and architecture so that you can actually go there and experience it. That's the main thing. Elsewhere, you can't go back into India in quite the same way and experience the wisdom of 5,000 years ago, or China or Japan. It's there, but it's not there in quite this extent. So it's in Egypt that we actually have access to that ancient wisdom, as it were, and Egypt is at least as good, or maybe the best anyway. It's my particular focus. Egypt provides us with that access to the lost knowledge and the ancient wisdom that, with the right direction ourselves and the right kind of inner and outer work, that makes possible the Renaissance that must lead us out of the chaos if a civilization is to supplant the chaos in which we find ourselves enmeshed at the moment. And finally, this is the goal of it all, it's the battle of Horus and Set, and with Horus victorious and Set reconciled at a certain point, at least this is the theory, I haven't got there yet myself, at a certain point, our consciousness becomes that of the stars. We become imperishable, immortal, divine. This is the science of immortality, and is only that science that must prevail if a true civilization is to follow the present era of chaos. Thank you.
Yes, Mr. West, that at the time of Jesus, I guess the holy sites were occupied by an unfriendly political power, and that didn't seem to overly annoy Jesus. Can you take some comfort in the fact that he saw past all that and saw the greater meanings?
Oh yeah, I would think so. I mean, of course we don't. We have no direct access to the actual life of Jesus. I mean, this is one of the problems with a written tradition, is that you can scramble it any way that you want. And of course, the early church was very revisionist, so there's no way actually of documenting how or what Jesus felt about the situation in Egypt. What we can say, and this with certitude, is that enshrined in looking at the underlying meaning of the Gospels, the wisdom of Egypt is enshrined in those Gospels, taking a somewhat different form, just as the wisdom of Zoroaster and Vedic India is enshrined in that. So Jesus, according to Schwaller, actually, let me put it this way, Schwaller had a very interesting insight into Christianity. I must say, me personally, I have trouble with institutionalized religions of any sort. I have trouble, and probably would have even then. But institutions don't go down well with me. I'm an anarchist, sort of an anarchist. Anyway, Schwaller made an observation that the purpose of Christianity was to take the wisdom of the temple out of the hands of an elite, which it had then become. In other words, it had become very restrictive. It shouldn't, earlier, as Graham was saying, if you asked the right questions, you got in, just as you wouldn't say, like Major League Baseball was also an elite. I can't go on the field and play with the New York Yankees, even if I want to. What is this? This is a democracy. Why can't I play? No, I haven't paid my dues, and I haven't asked the right questions. If you asked the right questions, you could do it. But according to Schwaller, the purpose of Christianity was to take the wisdom of the temple out of the temple and make it available to everyone. And you might almost say, it's a very interesting way of looking at history, that we're in the pickle we're in now because humanity at large, Western humanity, did not take advantage of that tremendous possibility opened up to it in principle by Christianity. In fact, it went exactly the opposite way and made it more restrictive than ever it was. But if you ask me what what Jesus's reaction to that would have been, I honestly can't answer. But certainly, living at that time, he probably would have known that he was saying the same thing, but in a language designed for a new age. The old age had died. Just as now we're on the cusp of a new age. The old stuff that's been supporting us for all of this time is about to go out the window, but the new form hasn't taken place yet. This is why there's all that confusion.
John, could you do me a favor and elaborate a little bit more about your interpretation and the symbolist interpretation or meaning of immortality and its relationship to transcendence? It seems to me to be one of the more problematic aspects of what it was that they were trying to do in relationship to a civilization and an individual soul. It's certainly very ambiguous. I think Graham mentioned, it's a 50-50 shot. Does it exist? Doesn't it? There's no proof. So is it all hinged on immortality, or how are they interpreting it from your point of view?
Well, okay. That's a tough question and a good one. When you deal with concepts like immortality or transcendence, you're already in trouble because you're trying to use linear language in order to describe something that's virtually indescribable. In a way, you can say it's the same problem. I mean, not many of us have experienced, maybe we have, but maybe not call it that for moments or so, something that we would call transcendence or immortality. But if you then try to describe it, the mystics have always had this problem of trying to describe what they felt, and they have to resort to metaphor. But let's say, if you try to describe moonbeams to the blind, you'll get nowhere. If you try to describe sex to eunuchs, they'll get angry. So you cannot sort of describe, you cannot talk about an esoteric tradition to the emotionally defective and the spiritually dyslexic, which is part of the great problem of conveying this kind of information to the academic world, because that's what mainly the academic world consists of. So when we deal with when we're talking about things like immortality, I can, let's say, explain it in terms that satisfy me. But if they don't communicate to you, there's almost nothing I can do about it. But somebody else's explanation might. And immortality is simply the fanning of this divine spark into a flame. It's the attainment of simply a higher level of consciousness that is outside of time. And this is the message of all of the esoteric and initiatic and shamanic religions that ever were. We have this capacity, but to describe it is almost useless, because you have to a certain extent, you have to have the belief, something has to convince you that this is possible. And as I said, this is the function of art. You go to Egypt, you go to these temples, you listen to a great piece of music, as I tell you, I mean, I'm being quite literal when I say that the Cathedral of Chartres and Beethoven's late quartet in C-sharp minor saved my life. I mean that quite literally. I mean, it was all absolutely meaningless, and suddenly that stuff was there, and I said, yes, it is there, and I sort of held that, and didn't quite go down under with it, and then gradually over the years became convinced that this was so, and that there are paths, there are disciplines that allow you to follow upon that path. But that is immortality. In other words, it's the attainment of that higher level of consciousness, and toward that aim, all of Egypt was directed. So I hope that's a satisfactory answer, but it's really as good as words can do, or at least as good as my words can do. You have to get it, sort of, and then the penny drops in the slot, and at a certain moment you say, yes, that's what they mean. It's not just words. But until a certain point, until it resonates within you, it really is just words, and it's one of the terrible problems that people believing this sort of thing, or people who are sure that this, who know from their own experience that this is so, have in trying to communicate this to people who are either, of course you can't convince it to those who are convinced it's not so, but even to those who are open, it is a matter of experience. I mean, if I tried to tell you you know, if I try to, everybody's been in love, so it's easy. But if you had a bunch of people who've never been in love and you tried to tell them, well, here's all this thing, it's a lot of fun, but boy, is it a lot of trouble. And you tried to communicate that to people who didn't have this capacity or who had no experience of it, you'd be lost. Well, it's a bit like that with these words, when you use words like immortality and transcendence and transformation. But if the penny drops in the slot, that's different.
Folks, we are now
Okay.
more than a half hour behind.
We'll catch up later.
So John, how did the whole symposium idea get started?
Actually, it was my brainchild. I've had the idea for quite a while, actually ever since we started this gathering of plan, as it were, and I met with Paul Roberts and Graham Hancock and Robert Boval and the Flemats, and all of a sudden there were a number of us, and more or less coeval with that, or simultaneous to that, we got involved with the Society for Scientific Exploration, and Schock and myself gave a lecture, each short presentation at their annual conference on anomalous archaeology, and we went down very well with all of those assembled scientists. And then I put the idea to them, hey, what about an actual symposium on lost knowledge, and thinking also at the time that the society itself is very concerned about the respectability of its image, almost overly concerned as far as I'm concerned. But what they're not terribly good at is getting out there in the open and letting a lot of people know that they exist, and that here are these very brave scientists looking into things that most scientists absolutely wouldn't even consider. And all of these guys are actually, or almost all of them, are university connected, and so they can imagine the kind of abuse they've got to put up with from their colleagues. And I thought the symposium was a way of, anyway, making the society more public and drawing attention to the existence of all of these people looking into all of these strange subjects. So, the dual purpose, as it were, for us, SSE sponsorship wouldn't exactly get us respectability or credibility, since the SSE itself is suspect within its own field. It would mean the imprimatur of a rigorously scientific body, which, however, even people don't like it or dislike it intensely, they can't deny that its membership is made up of people with all of the same credentials as the opposition. So this fact alone was good for us. In other words, it gave us a, hey, at least there are some scientists out there, guys, who don't think we're so bad, sort of an image. And us in turn, symbiotic relationship, the association for the SSE with us meant a fair amount of publicity and the ganging together of all of us, some of us obviously fairly well known. So in other words, it would confer upon the society a kind of respectable notoriety, and would help, I thought, in getting their message out to more people, drawing membership in. I mean, nobody knows they exist. So that's how it all started, and they saw it that way too, and all of a sudden, months later and 15 billion phone calls in between, here we are.
So the theme is return to the source. What does that mean?
Well, return to the source is a word, was a term Shvalod Lubitsch coined or used or translated from the Egyptian, meaning the ability or the capacity of human beings to reach a higher state, or that higher state of consciousness that is our origin, according to esoteric tradition, time immemorial, and everybody who believes things that way. So return to the source has a dual meaning, or double entendre here, actually, because in the one sense it is that philosophical and metaphysical capacity to return to divine origins, but also historically it's a return, it seems, or it has the connotation of a return back to this earlier civilization that we're all interested in or studying in one capacity or another. So that's basically return to the source.
And I guess really trying to talk about oral tradition in Aboriginal cultures and how for thousands of years, at least the Plains Indians survived, and all of their language, their culture, their heritage has survived for thousands of years without having been written down and whatnot. How important is oral tradition in an ancient society?
Depends which ancient society. I mean, it's hard to know. Generalized, it obviously was the tradition. That was the way before writing that people handed things down. And the curious thing is that over the last few years, a number of people have realized that actually the invention of writing carries a very deep price. I think when Plato said something about when writing was an invention, he said that this is a catastrophe, people will lose their memories. And actually, in the point that people don't seem to realize about an oral tradition is that it's, on the one hand, it's a mental training in and of itself, because things have to be remembered in order to be passed down. But my understanding now from some of the Hindu scholars, Vedic scholars over the last few years, I always thought, oh well, why not? Yes, you can hand things down perfectly coherently, but still, what do you lose? And then I realized from some of these new Vedic studies that, in fact, it isn't that way at all, because people were taught, people's memories were trained. In fact, the art of memory goes right up to Elizabethan times. People specifically trained their memories. And so in the training of the memory, these long texts, tremendously long texts, would be remembered word for word and passed down over the generations, in fact, more accurately even than writing, because presumably the storytellers could alter the words as the language changed itself over time, and yet the meaning would be handed down absolutely exactly, whereas the written word is worse, because, in fact, it's very difficult to get into the mindset of even just a few centuries ago. I mean, reading Shakespeare, let's face it, for most people, really is really a task, because half the words we don't use anymore, or we use in a different context. So the written language is actually less exact than the oral language. Obviously, it has the advantage of being able to transmit more information, because the information can be stored, but it carries with it this price of forcing people not to rely upon their own faculties. So it's a good question. It's usually that answer is given, oh well, you know, this was a great step forward when it was just an oral tradition. It's primitive. In fact, there's a price that has to pay for its advantages.
Often we look for the origin of civilization and the possession of ancient knowledge and wisdom in the old world, i.e. Africa or India or Egypt. And of course, this is done through archaeology, and through time, as we know, this knowledge has been lost. Do you see a way of us looking for some of these ideas, some of this old knowledge within Aboriginal culture?
Oh yeah, of course. I mean, this has been done recently by a number of people. Actually, most recently, William Sullivan, in that extraordinary book of his Secret of the Incas, where he decodes the Andean, Peruvian, Mexican myths and shows that enshrined in those myths are the stories of the movements of the heavens, so that when you know what all of the characters mean, you can actually relate them to astronomical events and therefore date the genesis of those tales. So, I mean, this is just one example, but there's obviously a vast amount of the old wisdom locked into these, as you call them, Aboriginal tribes, but it's simply the Western contempt for their way of going about things that, of course, makes us call them primitive. Some of them are very sophisticated, and I guess I mean, it's quite obvious to me, just reading a little bit about it. This is not my field at all, but just reading a little bit about it, I can see that there's cosmology written into those myths. I'm familiar with the Egyptian ones. You can see that these stories are complex cosmologies, as it were. I mean, they're a kind of, and it would be wrong, not a primitive kind of physics, but a sophisticated way of understanding the physical world expressed in myth and in symbol. And so it's really been partly the prejudice and partly the lack of insight of modern scholars to recognize that these simple sounding stories actually contain a vast amount of information of a genuinely scientific sort. But once we start looking for it, I would think there'd be somewhere, I would think, there would be a really legitimate field of people looking for the spiritual science locked in those Aboriginal cultures.
Okay, good. Colin Wilson in Atlantis to the Sphinx, he says, compared to Aboriginal people, civilized man has lost his sensitivity to nature. Do you agree with that?
Oh, absolutely, categorically. I mean, when you read accounts of people who've spent time with Bushmen or Eskimos or whatever, I mean, they all report how their host or whoever it was were sensitive to a whole spectrum of things about their surrounding world that the person doing the reporting, the gringo as it were, simply didn't know that they were happening. And if whoever it might have been spent enough time with the Aboriginals after a certain amount of time, that sensitivity could be retrained. So it's probably dormant within us. Maybe we haven't lost it, but we've simply lost the use of it, just as if you don't exercise a muscle, it'll atrophy. And who knows, if it atrophies long enough, maybe it's not, maybe you can't bring it back up. But with a bit of luck, I think that Aboriginal wisdom is in fact resurfacing, and once it's there, people can use what's applicable to a new age to enrich themselves. So yeah, I would think there's a fusion and a re-appreciation coming up sometime fairly soon.
Another thing, Colin Wilson, he described, I believe, Robert Graves talking about solar knowledge versus lunar knowledge. And I was just wondering if you could sort of talk about how we as a society might be able to get back to this way of life versus the current Western trend to be
in advance, practically, specifically, how it will be deployed and used under those circumstances. But once it's there, then people can decide how to use it.
How do you see religion today versus the religion that was practiced in ancient cultures?
Well, there's virtually no similarity between those two terms, even though both of them are called religion. What we have today is simply a dead shell of the religion of the past. Not that the religion of the past didn't have its own problems and flaws and so on, but all of the institutionalized religions today are basically power structures, and in fact most of them are either ignorant of or genuinely hostile to the metaphysical and mystical truths that fired these religions in the first place. So they become actually the antithesis of what they set out to be for the most part, which isn't to say that within them there aren't very good people and even wise people, but the institution is far more is the powerful, let's say, external operating agent, and all of them are absolutely rigid in their dogma, vicious in their execution, and ignorant, basically, of the tenets upon which their own religions are found. So, perhaps in the coming times, where very interesting things are going to happen, not inconceivable that they're able to recast themselves and rise from their own ashes, or maybe dissolve entirely, and the same principles upon which those religions were supposed to have been founded will be grafted onto new forms, and a new institution will arise, which probably in time will become as arthritic and sclerotic as the religions of today. But anyway, that's whether or not it takes that path remains to be seen.
How we see religion today versus how religion was practiced in ancient cultures.
Well, the comparison between what the religions are today compared to religions of the past, it's really as though we're talking about two different entities or two different institutions altogether. The religions of the past maybe had problems of their own, but just judging from their art and their architecture and their scripture and so on, it's clear that in the past they were vital, living forces designed to effectuate, actually, this return to the source. I mean, that's what the religions are all about. And over the years, for whatever reasons, it hardly matters, they have devolved, not evolved, into power structures, for the most part greedy, for the most part ignorant, and always self-seeking, and have become exactly the precise opposite of what they set out to be.
Okay, obviously we don't have to argue the importance of mythology and culture. Is there a way for us to validate oral tradition?
As far as us being able to validate oral tradition, actually, that's what a number of us here at the conference are doing. That's almost all we've been talking about, one way or another. Yes, it's possible to validate it, particularly when mathematics and astronomy is encoded within the mythology. Then it becomes objectively, virtually, you might say objectively unarguable about the level of knowledge and wisdom enshrined within the myths. Other interpretations really are a personal thing. Difficult to prove psychological or spiritual or esoteric meaning within the myths, but those who speak that language or are open to learning that language, that's not everybody, but those who are can then read those myths not just as artifacts from the past or even admirable artifacts from the past, but actually as real sources of living wisdom that can be put into actual practice. I mean, the myths teach you a lot about the way the world works, and when you know that, you can actually deploy that in the conduct of your own life, actually.
Okay, last question here. As we were saying, it is called return to the source. How do we find that source? Is there a way to do it?
Well, there are many ways to do it. That's what all of the religions started out to do. And even now, particularly in the East, I think, there are practices that, when we engage in them in the right spirit, it teaches us how to do exactly that. In other words, how to access at least moments of that higher state of being. And once those moments are experienced, then the rest of life you can handle it, as it were. You know, even if you can't get there often, just a few moments of it over the course of a lifetime tell you, yes, there is something very big, and it's not out there, it's in here, but it's there, and I know that it's there, and with that knowledge, life is lived in a very different way.